From our Chicago studios, this is the Muslim News on Muslim Network TV. Assalamu alaikum, I'm Samana Siddiqui. Our top story tonight. A group of Palestinians has initiated legal action against the Biden administration. They are accusing it of not preventing what they term an unfolding genocide during Israel's recent war on Gaza. The lawsuit, joined by the Palestinian human rights organizations Al-Haq and Defense for Children International, seeks to compel the U.S. to uphold its international legal obligations in preventing potential genocide by Israel. The suit claims that the ongoing crisis in Gaza has been enabled by unwavering support from President Joe Biden, Secretary of State Antony Blinken, and Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin. The suit alleges that these leaders are violating responsibilities under the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide. The lawsuit features statements from leading genocide experts who argue that the U.S. must use its influence to prevent such crimes. It was filed in the District Court for Northern California, asserting jurisdiction due to the international treaty violation. The Center for Constitutional Rights and Vanderhoot LLP are representing the Palestinian plaintiffs. This legal action represents a significant effort to halt Israel's violence in Gaza amid global pro-Palestinian protests. A number of current and former Democratic congressional aides are openly opposing higher-ups' stance on Israel's war on Palestine. They recently held a walkout ceremony at the U.S. Capitol, laying 10,000 carnations to symbolize civilian lives lost in the month-long conflict. The anonymous aides are demanding a ceasefire and the release of more than 200 hostages held by Hamas, along with de-escalation. They argued that their constituents have been pleading for a ceasefire for weeks and that it is their responsibility to respond. In a recent survey by Data for Progress, 66% of Americans supported an immediate ceasefire as a step toward peace for both Palestinians and Israelis. While most congresspersons from both parties continue to reject calls for a ceasefire, citing Israel's right to defend itself, many young Democratic staff members feel that the issue clashes with their core values. The internal rift symbolizes a broader debate in the United States and on Capitol Hill about a recently approved $14.5 billion emergency aid package to Israel. In related news, as many as 100 U.S. Foreign Service officials, including staff from the State Department and USAID, have issued a strongly worded internal memo criticizing President Joe Biden's handling of Israel's war on Palestine. The memo, organized by Sylvia Yacoub, accuses Biden of failing to de-escalate Israel's relentless attacks on Gaza. The officials say Biden's actions amount to supporting Israeli war crimes and/or crimes against humanity. The memo alleges that the White House and U.S. National Security Council have displayed a disregard for Palestinian lives and a lack of strategic foresight. It also condemns Biden for refusing to place conditions on U.S. aid to Israel and for questioning the accuracy of casualty reports from Gaza. The officials argued that Israel's actions, including cutting off essential supplies to Gaza, constitute war crimes under international law. Despite calls for a ceasefire, Biden has only advocated for a humanitarian pause to allow civilians to flee and aid to enter Gaza. While dissent memos are treated with confidentiality, this memo has become public. Multiple similar memos are reportedly circulating within the State Department, reflecting growing internal criticism of the Biden administration's pro-Israel policy. The State Department emphasized its commitment to allowing employees to express policy disagreements without fear of retribution. Google, known for its open corporate culture, is facing internal discord as employees express contrasting views on Israel's war on Palestine. Pro-Palestinian employees claim they are hesitant to voice their opinions, fearing repercussions. Employees, both Muslim and Jewish, have written an open letter to Google's leadership, accusing the company of a double standard regarding freedom of expression. They say the company has allowed supporters of Israel to speak freely about their opinions on the topic, while taking a heavy hand with Muslim employees who have criticized Israel's retaliation in Gaza. The letter has asked Google leadership like Sundar Pichai, Thomas Kurian, and others to issue a public condemnation of the ongoing genocide in the strongest possible terms. It also addresses Google's involvement in Project Nimbus, a $1.2 billion contract with Israel for AI and computing power, which some employees believe could be used for surveillance of Palestinians. Google's response has been that the discord is limited to a small group of its many employees, but tensions persist. Employees demand a public condemnation of the conflict and the cancellation of the Project Nimbus contract. The American Medical Association has rejected a resolution calling for a ceasefire in Gaza to support healthcare workers. The decision comes amid growing concerns about the dire state of hospitals in Gaza. The AMA had previously called on all parties to minimize the health impact on civilians. Dr. Hossein Antar, speaking on behalf of medical residents and fellows supporting the ceasefire resolution, argued that it was necessary for the organization to take note of the dire state of health officials in Gaza. The AMA's resolution committee claims that the demand for a ceasefire did not meet the organization's criteria for addressing healthcare-related issues. This decision sparked outrage, with critics arguing that the situation in Gaza met the criteria of advocacy, ethical considerations, and urgency. The resolution ultimately failed to pass with a vote of 136 to 458. Public health experts and healthcare workers believe that the AMA's leadership silenced the discussion on the resolution, despite knowing that their position was wrong. A UN official has suggested parachuting aid into Gaza as a last resort. Andrea De Domenico, head of the UN Office for Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs in the occupied Palestinian territory, emphasized the logistical difficulties involved in such an operation. Speaking at a news briefing, De Domenico expressed reservations about the feasibility of aid parachuting, saying it is an expensive and unsustainable option. He highlighted that alternative methods of delivering assistance should be explored if all parties can agree on unimpeded and continuous access. De Domenico's statements come in response to Palestinian Prime Minister Mohammed Shtayyeh's call on the European Union and the UN to consider parachuting aid into Gaza. The UN official suggested that prioritizing the opening of border crossings and ensuring a consistent flow of supplies should be the primary focus, rather than resorting to extreme measures. De Domenico acknowledged that Jordan had already attempted an airdrop via aircraft, but noted that the quantities delivered were limited. Humanitarian group urges safe passage for medical mission in Gaza. Details after the break, so stay tuned and we'll be right back. Welcome back. The Palestine Red Crescent Society has issued a desperate plea to the international community, urging Red Cross, Red Crescent partners, and UN agencies to facilitate safe passage for medical missions in Gaza. The call for action comes as the humanitarian crisis in northern Gaza's hospitals worsens rapidly. Shelling recently thwarted an attempt by PRCS and the International Committee of the Red Cross to send an evacuation team to Al-Quds Hospital, rendering it non-operational due to fuel shortages. The hospital's medical team and patients are trapped without essentials like food, water, and electricity. PRCS reports that ambulances were prevented from traveling in northern Gaza by the Israeli army, forcing residents to abandon bodies in the streets. Hospitals in the region are besieged or out of service, leaving civilians without emergency medical services. Al-Shifa Hospital, also in northern Gaza, faces dire conditions with a severe shortage of electricity, water, and food. Premature babies had to be removed from incubators, resulting in casualties. Israeli forces obstructed attempts to leave the hospital and prevented the retrieval of bodies. The World Health Organization has called for an immediate ceasefire, but Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and President Joe Biden have rejected growing calls for such action. Israel conducted a series of airstrikes targeting the city of Khan Yunis in southern Gaza, causing significant loss of life and injuries. Despite calls for civilians in northern Gaza to move to the southern safe zone, the strikes resulted in at least 13 Palestinian deaths, including children, and numerous injuries. The airstrikes primarily targeted homes of the Al-Agha and Abu Ghemaize families. The situation in Gaza worsened as 179 individuals, including infants and intensive care patients, had to be buried in a mass grave at Gaza's Al-Shifa hospital complex. Israeli army tanks were stationed near the hospital, where civilians faced extreme challenges. Israeli forces also conducted a large-scale raid on Tulkarem refugee camp in the occupied West Bank, resulting in 6 Palestinian deaths and several arrests. Israel claimed to have taken control of several Hamas administrative facilities and reported 2 more soldiers' deaths, bringing the total to 46. The Palestinian Health Ministry notes that over 11,240 Palestinians, including 4,630 children and 3,130 women, have been killed in Gaza since October 7th. Israel reported 1,200 deaths, with 240 people as hostages with Hamas. The Supreme Court has released its first ever code of conduct. This will aim to govern the behavior of its most powerful judges. It comes after a number of high-profile scandals involving relationships between right-wing justices and billionaires. The code is largely based on existing requirements for lower court judges. It contains rules that are not entirely new. However, watchdog groups have criticized the document for being unclear about how it will be enforced. In a statement, the Supreme Court says the code was created to dispel the notion that its justices consider themselves exempt from ethics rules. It emphasized that the code largely represents principles they have long upheld. Some observers nevertheless view the introduction of an explicit code of conduct as a landmark moment in the court's history. Several migrant families in Brooklyn who arrived at the newly opened shelter at Floyd Bennett Field have expressed dissatisfaction with the accommodations. City Hall says some families declined to settle at the shelter despite the lack of alternative placements for them. The migrants had not been informed in advance that they would be staying in a tent city, and upon seeing the conditions, they refused to stay. Mayor Eric Adams' office cited a lack of space for the move. Mayoral spokesperson Kayla Mamalak says over 65,600 migrants are already in their care, and more are arriving each week, leaving them with limited options for shelter. Unlike traditional family shelters, the migrants were expected to live in shared pods without complete privacy or kitchen facilities. The decision to use Floyd Bennett Field as a shelter has faced opposition. Concerns have been raised about its remote location, lack of transportation access, and floodplain designation. Joanne Ariola, Queen's council member, has even filed a lawsuit to shut down the site. That's all from our Chicago studios tonight. Thank you for tuning in. You can subscribe to our YouTube channel and hit the bell icon for the latest updates. For more content, keep watching Muslim Network TV or visit muslimnetwork.tv. Salam and good night.